just over a few years, made such a
fine.
huge contribution to us in terms of our research culture, work in research ethics, and probably isn't always recognised for the work that he does behind the scenes, working with people and encouraging Christian research. So, Philip, just want to honour you today as well and say how privileged we are to be able to host this. So, congratulations, Philip. Welcome, everybody. And I'll hand over to Stephen Reid, who is our MC for today. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for that warm welcome, indeed. My name's Stephen Reid, for those that don't know me. I'm the Research Coordinator at the Christian Research Association, and I welcome you on behalf of CRA to the launch of Philip's, or CRA and Philip's contribution to research Australia's religious and non-religious communities. I'd like to I suppose, introduce Philip, although he probably doesn't need that much introduction, but I'll do so anyway. Philip was the founding director of CRA back when it started, and he was appointed to that role in 1985. He served as CRA's senior researcher until his retirement after 31 years with the organisation. It's not retirement, but not really. Since 2016, he was employed part-time with Harvest Bible College, now Alphacrucis University College, through the merger, until he again retired, probably earlier this year. Philip's an ordained minister in the Uniting Church of Australia. Professionally, he continues to wear multiple hats, including board member and honorary treasurer of the CRA, secretary of CRA's Human Research Ethics Committee. He's also an accredited researcher with CRA, and of course we know him as a writer of books that are down the back there if you're interested too. So Philip, I'll hand over to you. We look forward to you sharing your insights with us now. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and for being part of this. And it'd be good to share some of the findings from the census. Let me get this right. The sound right? Yeah. With you. And then Tanya Riches will be responding in a few minutes. The census data provides accurate Australia-wide information about how people identify themselves in relation to religious organisations. And it provides details about small religious groups that can't be obtained anywhere else. You can't get that sort of information from sample surveys. And it does enable us to cross-tabulate with a wide range of other data, including birthplace and language and occupation and family relationships. And one of my delights is that just in the last year or so, longitudinal data has been released for people who don't have a lot of money like me to use. You did have to pay for it in the past, but now you don't have to even pay for it. And so you can see how people's responses to various questions have changed over time. It also provides details of information about local areas. So very specific local areas, and we've done a lot in the past about providing information for local churches about the people in their local areas and so on. And we're still doing some of that, and certainly capable of doing that as that's required of us. But there's weaknesses in the data too. There's many reasons why people identify with a particular religion. Part of it may be heritage, maybe their work, where they volunteer. It certainly doesn't mean involvement or beliefs or practices. So it doesn't tell us whether people in fact are telling us whether they believe in God or not. The fact that they say that they're no religion doesn't mean that they've actually given up belief in God. On the other hand, the fact that they identify with a Christian denomination doesn't mean either that they do. So you've got to take that into account. And there's some inaccuracies as well. Certainly we find that quite a lot of people, and increasing numbers, and I'll come to this later, just are writing in Christian. And we know by the use of the longitudinal data that last time quite a lot of them put in Pentecostal, or they've put in Churches of Christ, and in both cases some leaders have invited people to say Christian rather than to identify with a particular denomination. The other thing is that it doesn't indicate the extent of their spirituality in any sense. So to use it in that form is misleading. And as I indicated, no religion doesn't necessarily mean no spirituality or atheism. I had a lot of trouble. I was invited to the Atheist Society one time and had a lot of trouble trying to convince them that in fact there weren't that many atheists around. When you actually look at the sample survey data where people actually are invited to say atheist, it's a lot less than say no religion. Just a few facts from the book that you're invited to purchase if you haven't done so. The most Christian city in Australia is in fact Sydney, followed by Brisbane. But it's also the most Islamic city in Australia, followed by Melbourne. It's the most Hindu city in Australia, followed by Canberra, interestingly, and then Melbourne. Melbourne's very close. But it's not the most Anglican city in Australia. If you're looking at proportions of people who identify, that's Hobart. And secondly is Perth. So Sydney's a little way down the list there. Nor is it the most Pentecostal city in Australia by percentage-wise. That's Brisbane. And that is followed by Darwin. And the most no religion place in Australia is Hobart, capital city-wise, and followed by Adelaide. So just some interesting things to ponder there. There's a lot of information on that page, but let me try and identify just a few things. Now, some of the denominations have certainly declined greatly in terms of the numbers of people identifying with them. Lutherans have declined by 53%. This is Sydney, okay? This is Sydney data, 53%. But nationally, they've certainly declined by over 30%. Uniting Church down by 37%, just in 10 years. So huge decline there. And the Anglicans down by 32%. So despite the enormous emphasis given to evangelism there, certainly those who are identifying, there's a significant decline. There's smaller declines in a number of other groups. So the Baptists are down a little bit, just by 5%. Catholics by 2%. Eastern Orthodox down by 4%. Interestingly, the Eastern Orthodox across Australia have actually maintained their numbers but are falling by percentage. The Greeks and so on have certainly maintained their sense of identity, even if it doesn't mean that they're frequent attenders. The one group that's rising is the Oriental Christians in Sydney. And amongst those, of course, are the Coptic Orthodox. That's the biggest group of Oriental Christians. And they've been rising very rapidly over some decades now, but particularly over the last decade or two. And it's immigration. But what happens with immigration is that most people who immigrate come out as young people in their 20s, and then they start having families. So It's their families too. But the other group, right down the bottom, that's really interesting, is the Christian not further defined. So people who've just written in Christian, gone up by 80% in 10 years. And again, one wonders what's behind that. Part of it is that they're not identifying with a specific religious group. They are identifying more generally than that. And to some extent, one can say it's a sign of individualism in the ways in which people are thinking about their faith. On the far right of that table is the people who are in their 30s, and I think that that gives us some sense of what's going to happen in the future. People in their 30s generally are fairly stable in terms of their religious identity, and that then carries through for the rest of their lives. So we can expect that the Anglicans, who are now about 9% of the population, may well diminish to about 5%. Baptists will go down slightly, Catholics down a little bit, Eastern Orthodox down a bit, and so on. Pentecostals are likely to stay fairly stable, if that's an indication. Uniting Church will continue to decline down to less than 1%. But Christian, not further defined, is likely to remain fairly stable, or even go up. Let me just remind you again that identity in the census doesn't equal attendance at anything. So we've got nearly 500,000 Anglicans in Sydney, 60,000 Baptists, 1.2 million Catholics, 48,000 Pentecostals. But if you look at the patterns of attendance, then it looks a bit different. 62,000 Anglicans attend based on survey data. 53,000 Baptists attend. 211,000 Catholics are attending. And 73,000 Pentecostals. So the Pentecostals, in fact, come up to the second largest group in terms of attendance. So the patterns are very different when you look at the actual involvement of people. It's really interesting with the Pentecostals, when you look at the surveys, there's a whole lot of people who actually go to Pentecostal churches but still identify, when it comes to the census, with one of the other groups. You know, there's a lot who say, well, I'm Anglican, but I happen to attend a Pentecostal church at the moment, Catholic or whatever. But again, part of the story is those who just claim to be Christian too. So overall, there's large numbers there. Let's looking at the bigger picture in terms of the other religions. Certainly, we've got the Hindus and the Sikhs, which are growing enormously, and again have been for the last decade or two. So Hindus up 123% in one 10-year period, one decade, and the Sikhs are up 105%. And that's when most of the Sikhs actually end up in Melbourne. They're growing even faster in Melbourne. Overall, Australia-wide, the Sikhs are the fastest growing religious group in Australia, grown by about 280% in the last 10 years. No religion is up nearly 110% within a decade. So again, huge growth there. There's some other interesting things going on there. The Muslims are not growing quite as much as they were, down 58% growth, still very significant growth. But the Buddhists have actually growing less than the rate of the population. So while they grew by 11%, the population grew by 19%. And so the Buddhists, in fact, are going backwards. We reckon that around about 100,000 people have moved from Buddhism to no religion within the last decade across Australia. And I think that reflects part of what's happening with the patterns of migration. So a lot of the Buddhists arrived here as Vietnamese in the 1970s. We're down to late 1970s, 80s. We're into the third generation now, and they're not identifying to anything like the same extent. And there's indications too that that's happening with other religions. Islam, it's happening with a little bit. Hinduism, it seems to be happening. Now, a lot of the Hindus are very recent, so they're very enthusiastically involved, but again, second or third generation down, and that weakens significantly. Just a few more facts. No religion is in fact growing faster in Sydney than in Melbourne. Its proportions has doubled in the last 10 years. And there are more people in their 30s of no religion in Sydney than there are Christians. And now more Hindus and more Islamic people in their 30s than there are Anglicans in their 30s. And Sydney is growing in no religion and in other religions. Just sources of growth and decline. Certainly immigration is one of the big factors. 83,000 immigrants identifying themselves as Christian in 2021 arrived in Sydney in the last 5 years, this is. We reckon there's 109,000 people born with being given a Christian identity by their parents. And it's interesting that my estimates from longitudinal data, which is not available for 2021 yet, but it will be, from 2011 to 2016, suggest that there could be 242,000 who were not involved in a religious group in 2016, but were in 2021. So there's quite a lot of movement in. On the other hand, we reckon that 660,000 have moved out of Christian identity out to almost all to no religion. And about 70,000 people who had identified in 2016 have died in that period. So that just gives you some clues there. As we've said, major influences are immigration. Twice as many immigrants are involved in religious groups than people born in Australia. That's where they find their support for their language, culture, values in those religious groups. And in fact, across Australia, almost half of all church attenders are either immigrants or members of their families. And immigration has contributed greatly to Baptist, Catholic, Pentecostal and Oriental Christian numbers, as well as the Hindu, Islamic, Sikh and Baha'i growth. But immigrant involvement declines over time. As we've said, the percentage of Buddhists now in decline, and some recent work that John Newton has been supervising has suggested that many mono-ethnic churches last about 30 years. There's some different things in this census to all the previous censuses that I've looked at. Certainly there's been decline in the proportion of Christians since 1971. But mostly it's been younger people, 20 to 35 years old, filling in the census for the first time and choosing no religion when they've done so. But in the latest census, people of all age groups were moving to no religion. And in fact, some of the largest proportions were people in their 45, 55 age group. And there was quite a lot of people 60, 70 plus who were moving to no religion. The other thing is that's been different in my observations from previous times is that this decline is occurring right across Australia in all areas, in rural areas as well as urban areas. Indeed, in rural areas, the decline is a little more rapid than in urban areas. And it's also happening overseas as well. I was fascinated when the British census figures came out a few months later, following the Australian census. And while we've got 44%, I think it is, who identify as Christian, they have 43%, almost identical. And the amount of change is very similar in the UK to what it is here. I think that all of that adds up to suggesting that there's large-scale cultural change in values. Now, in the past, most theorists have suggested that secularisation would take place because of beliefs and changes in beliefs. The idea that certainly Comte and others developed back in the 19th century was that scientific thinking would replace the thinking from of religious thinking. That didn't happen to any great extent. What secularisation has occurred, but it seems to have occurred in a different sort of way. It seems to have occurred in relation to values rather than in relation to beliefs. Certainly the beginning of the 20th century, we saw a number of sort of groups like the rationalists and the free thinkers and so on evolving, but it wasn't a big change. But it's now that this bigger change is occurring and is occurring right across our societies. One of the best theories that I've seen of what the change is been developed by Ronald Inglehart, who's done a lot of work on values over a long period of time. He argues that there's been a change from values around duty to family, community and nation. Duties which were given to us by our position, gender and age. Duties which were gender-based, so women's duty was to bear and raise children and look after the home, and men were to be the breadwinners. I've been doing some family history stuff and looking back at the 19th century, and it's been the size of the families was incredible in those times, and that's what the women did, and the census recorded that in those times in terms of occupation. Women didn't have an occupation except home duties. What has evolved, particularly since World War II, is this emphasis on personal fulfilment, and each individual having the opportunity to find a style of life which gives fulfilment. And in general, that's been the duties, family duties has been supported by the religions, whereas the personal fulfilment values have generally been seen, at least, even if not experienced, have been seen as being opposed by religion. Inglehart suggests that there's a number of reasons why the change in values has occurred. One of the bigger things is the low rates of child mortality. People had a lot of children because they expected that many wouldn't live. Social welfare systems now look after us. We're not dependent on having children to look after us in our old age. There's more effective birth control. Children have become an economic cost rather than being a benefit. Now we have to support them till they're into their 20s rather than sending them out to work when they're 10, you know. And with greater wealth, people feel that they can pursue individual fulfilment. On the other hand, those sorts of values have actually been opposed by a lot of the religious groups. There has been some opposition to the equality of women, especially in terms of leadership. Opposition to the regulations about divorce in the 1970s when the government moved to change that, opposition to sex outside marriage and to same-sex marriage. And also, one of the other things we've seen in the data is that a lot of business people have just drifted away from the churches. And there's a sense there, and certainly that's been measured in some of our surveys, that the churches are not very positive about making money, making profits. And that's what the lives of many business people are about. And that conflict just leads to people sort of moving out. But others have stayed. And some people continue to value the traditional forms of family life and gendered roles, including many of our immigrants, and to find support for that way of life, especially in the evangelical and charismatic churches. And I think it's that support which is behind the fact that those churches, while they may be decreasing, are decreasing very slowly and gradually. But as the difference from what's in the wider society grows, so in fact within those communities there feels a greater need for support. It's really interesting to look at, from the census again, the proportion of women 15 to 50 with 3 or more children. It's indicative, I think, of how important family life is. And certainly we find amongst Anglicans, Baptists, Lutherans, Pentecostals uniting, it's virtually the same proportion in all of those denominations. Interesting, it's slightly down amongst the Catholics. And I think that may have to do with the fact that there's a higher level of nominalism, as it were, amongst the Catholics in that age group. Greater amongst the Muslims, a long way down with sort of the Hindus, and I think that may be partly due to the fact that many of them are recent immigrants, and certainly way down in terms of no religion. So again, it does appear that all of the religious groups, progressive and conservative, are actually still supporting those family values. The whole of society, however, has changed if it's to support the ideals of personal fulfilment. A new set of values is needed: tolerance and affirmation of diversity, tolerance of fluidity in relationships and personal identity, importance of consent as becoming a big issue. Again, reflecting individuals and the right of individuals to follow their own path. And the condemnation of lack of acceptance of diversity is certainly a big issue. And women to have equal opportunities and rewards as men. And certainly there's been a widespread condemnation of inappropriate use of power over others. And that's coming out in relation to domestic violence. Then, so we're left with a big challenge for religious groups. And this is where I hand over to the theologians. How should we respond to these changes in culture? To what extent can religious groups affirm contemporary culture and individual fulfilment? To what extent do they need to stand over against the culture?
Previously, she's been a lecturer at Alphacrucis here, Senior Lecturer and Master of Theology Coordinator at Hillsong College, if I got that right, and the Research Pillar Leader at the Centre for Disability Studies at the University of Sydney. And just to prove she's a true Sydney-sider, she's currently researching Sydney for publisher Bloomsbury's Urban Christianity series. So thank you, Tanya. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thanks. Great. Thank you so much. I hope you don't mind, after being in 3 continents over the last 3 weeks, I've written out my contribution today. I know that those of you who are here and of the Pentecostal persuasion do still believe that the Spirit can speak through written text, but I feel to make my confession nevertheless. I think what I have to say will go about 15 minutes and 33 seconds, but if it's longer than that, you know I've had a divine revelation. We're here to support the release of Philip Hughes' book, and in a sense, Philip himself. And that's an easy task, in my opinion. Philip's strengths are evident. His contribution to the Theological Guild is unquestionable. If you go to Philip's Alphacrucis faculty page and you look at his single-authored volumes, it's mind-boggling. Philip and I first liaised in his role as the chair of the Human Ethics Research Committee. If you know him, he has a sharp attention to detail and he takes no prisoners, but he is also extraordinarily kind, and I've since known him as a colleague at the CRA. What I most appreciate about Philip is that he has nothing to prove. At his level of contribution, many scholars are either winding down their careers or engaging in peripheral passion projects, but he's expressed a desire to contribute his gifts back and further the task of theological education in Australia. To me, this signifies his passion for a new generation of Christian researchers. And in that sense, Philip is a futurist. And this book is provided in that spirit. It's not for those who look backwards to the good old days of their religious communities. It's for those who are brave, who are grappling with what is rather than what we wish were true. For me, that's exciting because Pentecostalism has always had these types of futurists, often called pioneers. The early Pentecostal church was, if not scientific, a keen observer of its social location. The type of Christianity it provided was relevant to urban cities and amidst increasing racial and gender divisions. It arguably spoke across ethnic and national lines. In fact, Pentecostalism was always more focused on the mission field than its own pews. And so for Pentecostals, this volume should be of great value as a missiological resource. Helpfully, Philip's book starts with a title, How to Use This Book. And let's be clear, he does hope for its use. This pragmatism assists almost anyone interested in Australia's religiosity. His data is drawn from the range of government surveys and his own research from CRA. The combined result is a lexicon of varied Australian religious groups, Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh, Baha'i, nature religions, and so forth. The history of each is helpfully summarised and its current status is reviewed. As an anthropologist of Christianity, my greatest takeaway was this clearly defined group of self-identifying Australian Christians. Philip here notes the problems with self-identification, and from a Pentecostal insider's perspective, of course, we can admit we often want to draw these lines in different ways. People who we sit next to on Sunday, people who tithe, people who worship in the same way that we do. These people, we think, are Christians. We're often unsure of those who are others. So this exercise is for those who are willing to examine the religious landscape through the lens of a sociologist. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't read the volume as a theologian or also define Christians more restrictively for religious purposes. In my view, however, the exercise of looking at who self-identifies as Christian is really valuable because it provides possibilities. But one of those possibilities is to look closely at the results of Christian leaders in Australia. They're evangelists, pastors, theologians, chaplains. In practical theological terms, this is a way to examine the fruit of Australian discipleship processes. Because the book does identify who is with us, so to speak, it of course brings into the question who does not identify with us. And the final question, who no longer identifies. And that question, undoubtedly, for the Christian community, unearths grief. Throughout the last 4 years, we've suffered grief upon grief upon grief. For Christians particularly, there have been highs and there have been lows. And it's natural to want to focus on the highs. But Christian decline in Australia is a fact. And it's a matter of public record that there have been Christian leadership failures. So the next question is, does decline mean that the Australian church is irrelevant or has failed? And I think here we can be a little bit more optimistic. Philip is not saying that pastors are not working hard or doing a good job or even that people are not converting. In fact, He notes that in the 2018 Australian Survey of Social Attitudes, 3.8% of Australians were raised as no religion, but now identify Christian. And 10% of Pentecostals reported this to be true. But overall, compared to the 4.3 to 4% who became more Christian during this decade, 19% moved the other way. So this book truly outlines how Australian society has changed. As some people have mentioned, I've been attempting to engage Christianity in the city of Sydney. That is actually a difficult task, as Christianity in Sydney is highly various. One of my interviewees, Amelia Co-Butler, who is a uniting pastor, suggested that the very nooks and crannies of the Sydney's harbour created the biodiversity of Christian expression. She suggests that the traffic patterns and the difficulty in moving from one side of the city to the other is a part of the religious landscape that they have fused. And I like that description and the possibility of us appreciating these different Christian contributions. As Philip said, Sydney is now the most Christian, the most Islamic and the most Hindu city of Australia, but not most Anglican, Pentecostal are not religious. And interestingly, while Sydney's decline was 10% over the decade in question, this can be compared against an 18% decline in the rest of the state. So maybe the question for Sydney's Christian institutions should be, what is keeping people affiliated when they might otherwise leave? Philip suggests, as is stated, that immigration is one of the answers. Although Christianity and Western ethnicities have disentangled, this is not true of other contexts. And that does match the research that's provided by Cristina Rocha from Western Sydney, for example, who notes that trendy Brazilian communities are forming within Australian Pentecostal churches, with a faith that is more liberating to these groups than the wall-to-wall tile and frilled curtain churches of their parents. She labels this cool Christianity. Philip's book notes that widely across Australia, it seems, youth have been encouraged to find their own voice and to find their own spirituality. And here he notes that Pentecostals do end up also looking quite good, retaining all but 2% of attendees in their 20s. So do Baptists with contemporary worship services. He does specify that. But notable is that over 19% of Australian Baptists were born in Asia. I think that's worth grappling with. A similar revitalisation has occurred from immigrants in Catholicism and Anglicanism, which is expected. But here, a Pentecostal starts to wonder. It's significant to note that Australia's immigration policy prioritises wealthy immigrants from prescribed areas of the world. On April 27th, the Immigration Minister, Honourable Claire O'Neill, released a paper entitled "A Migration System for a More Secure and Prosperous Australia." Point number one was prioritising the people that we need in order to enhance our security and economic prosperity. And we certainly see the economically prosperous in Sydney as they move into all available housing that the city provides. This often pushes Australian-born residents further west. The types of citizens that the state deems to be a priority are wealthy and, it turns out, largely Buddhist and Hindu. Here, the implied perception of what is good citizenship is notable. Perhaps there's need for Pentecostal scholars to grapple with their global marginalisation versus their relative Australian power. With the global expansion of Pentecostalism, it can be assumed that Pentecostal immigrants don't provide the state the needed economic boost. And I think we should be attentive to these global flows between the rest and the rest, north and south, but also where flow is prevented. Missing migrants offer Australian Christians a better chance to attune to the needs of the poor. Immigrants bring wealth, they also make wealth. Preventing entry into Western nations means effectively the economic benefits of remittances are not sent back to villages and to slums. But back to the book. I appreciate that Philip helpfully organises his data from A to Z. Under A for Anglicans, he charts the impact of grappling with the historical role of the state. The decline that can be seen in this community is a challenge to colonial power, as well as the reduced confidence in religious institutions, belief, and values. Of course, he does note, though, that it's a decline in nominal boomer religion compared to a vibrant, active faith of younger Anglicans. Under C for Christians, Philip notes a tendency for Australian Christians to emphasise their unity rather than denominational sectarianism. This also suggests that second-generation immigrants are grappling with the benefits and the drawbacks of an ethnic Christianity. Under N for no religion, Philip notes that there's been significant growth to 38% of the Australian population. This demographic is disproportionate towards the Australian-born, those living in de facto or same-sex relationships and lone parents, although many of them are open to a God or a higher power. And these you can see reoccur under S for spirituality. This tends to represent those with the diminishing interests in institution, an eclectic understanding of authority and connection to land and environment. Philip says insightfully, they are independent in their thinking and their patterns of life. Now, I realise that I've overemphasised the P for Pentecostal, but I thought it was worth going there for those from Alphacrucis who are here with us today. Philip charts the extraordinary growth of Australian Pentecostal denominations since '76. His analysis shows Pentecostal identity is rather fluid. It retains the possibility of connection with religious heritage and is open to Christianity as its overarching framework. And that would be true. We would say many Pentecostals know the name of their church, but they don't necessarily know the name of their denomination. And that's not considered a bad thing by leaders. In other words, arguably, the branding isn't salient for self-identity, but Christ is. Whether or not, if we put down the name of the church as in the census, whether that would change things, I'm not sure. And for Pentecostals who really like to focus on the positive, you would be extraordinarily happy to see the 150% attendance rates on the board earlier. And this is true for the urban Aboriginal Pentecostals that I studied in my PhD. They defied stereotypes. They probably would also say that they identify with Aboriginal religious identity. They worship together daily. And I know also that the measurable growth of Pentecostalism is seen in the Far Northern Territory. And I personally wonder whether that reflects the ACC Indigenous Initiative's consistent work in this area. And this leads me back to the importance of futurists and their place. What this book shows is that religious actions today form statistics tomorrow. Philip records it's a cultural moment for visionaries. Around 43% of Australians remain Christian, and there are reputedly 1.5 million immigrants set to enter Australia in the next 5 years. So, from where I sit, there are a few options for those who'd like to take Philip's research at face value and retain Christian growth. The first is to create a marketing campaign, have more babies for the Lord. Bear with me, because if the church is going to emphasise heterosexual marriage and the nuclear family, then it should also become a resource centre for carrying out child rearing, right? Philip's research grapples with the economic and emotional burden of Australian parenthood, and as a PhD who postponed having my toddlers, I feel seen by this research. He briefly proposes a rebalance of gender roles in church leadership and recognising that women's lives have changed. And for the church to better acknowledge carers, whether that be of the elderly or whether it be of the little people. The second is to see this as a missional opportunity. What is genuinely good and true? What leads to human flourishing? What fosters Christian discipleship? Surely if we pursue these things in our expressions of faith, the Christian church will be over the longer term healthier, whether or not its percentage increases. Philip states, throughout history, the ways of communicating the Christian faith have been re-examined and redeveloped as cultures have changed, and the Christian faith has been taken into new cultural contexts. That process needs to occur again as Western cultures change. The future of the churches lies in the ways they are able to nurture and sustain the sense of the Spirit. And here Philip does identify the specific work that needs to be done in reconnecting with the millennial exiles. Greater connection to the environment may allow many unaffiliated a reason to affiliate. Providing models of living more simply and wanting less are, to be honest, crucial for surviving this ecological crisis. So perhaps this moment offers Christians a chance to reconnect with the power of small things in their faith. A mustard seed or the infant Christ child. Selah. Many congratulations to you from all of us gathered here, Philip.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for that quite thoughtful, articulate, and sometimes humorous response. I very much appreciate you and appreciate the time that you've put into, obviously, looking at the book in detail and also your response to Philip.